In this lecture, we'll talk about instantiating our objects during runtime. Instantiation is basically just a fancy way of saying spawning objects into our scene while the game is running. Every time either our player ship explodes using our collision handler class, or we basically kill an enemy spaceship, we'd like to instantiate some sort of VFX particle explosion. Let's go ahead and set that up first so we have something to work with in our custom code. My hierarchy is getting just a little bit cluttered. I'm going to create an empty game object called enemies and just drag it into our enemies empty game object for now, just for organizational purposes. Just make a mental note for now that your actual enemy that's flying through your timeline might actually break now that it's parented differently. We'll get that sorted back out later. You have everything you need in your tool belt to create your own destroyed particle system VFX. Each individual time an enemy spaceship is destroyed, let's instantiate an explosion particle of some kind. Create your own particle system to be displayed when your enemy ships are destroyed. Take as much or as little time as you'd like on this. Mine's going to be pretty simple. We'll just create it in a few minutes. But don't forget to share it with the community. I'd love to see your unique creations, and I'm sure other students would like to see what you've come up with on your own. So now's the time to pause the video. I'll see you back here in a few moments, and we'll go through my solution together. Welcome back. In our hierarchy, let's create that effect particle system. And we may want to use this for both our player ship and our enemy ship. Let's just call it destroyed ship VFX. I'm going to position this in a way so that it's just right in front of my player ship, just so we can kind of see what it looks like in the game view. Let's first change up the type of particle that's coming directly from this particle system, just so we can visually see it a little bit better. How do we do that? We go into our particle system, down to our renderer module, and then we can assign a material to it. I think what I want to do is just use something very similar to our laser. So where did we put that? I think it's in our materials folder. And we've got our two different materials here that we've used for our laser. Let's do something just a little bit different. You could create it from scratch, but it's a little bit easier for me just to duplicate one of these, and then we'll rename it from there. I'm just going to duplicate the laser head, and we'll just call this my destroyed ship particle. Let's change my base map PNG from just this boring little circle up to my particle star. I think that would be pretty cool. We're not doing anything overly fancy, however. And let's just change the emission to something like what like a natural fire explosion would be, sort of like a orange sort of thing. Let's see what that looks like for now. Let's just assign that to our renderer material. Can't really see it. Oh, that's because I copied my laser head with the base map of 0 transparency. So we've just got to ramp that transparency back up to 100%. And there we go. We've got these little stars in our scene. Except we don't want it just displaying straight up in a cone. We just actually want to display our shape as a sphere, just kind of as like a natural explosion sort of thing. And unlike our laser particle system, for example, I just want a singular explosion right off at the beginning to emit. So the way that we can do that is we can actually scroll down to our emission module. I can actually change my rate over time to 0, and I just want to use a singular burst right at the beginning. So we can add a singular burst right here that I want to burst right at the 0-second mark. Let's do something like maybe 300 different particles. Already looking pretty snazzy, but let's go ahead and add a little bit of noise or randomness to my particle system. I think the duration is a bit too long. I think something like 1 would probably make a bit more sense. I think we can add a bit of randomness to each individual particle in this particle system. So we can go random between two constants, and we can change this to something like 0.2 to 0.5, let's say. Let's change our start speed to something quite a bit quicker, maybe something around 50. And you know what? That's already looking pretty good. We could change our simulation space from local to world, but in this case, I don't really think it's going to matter. We're not actually going to parent this particle system to anything. We're just going to instantiate in our hierarchy, and then it's going to be destroyed as a game object in our scene after the particle system runs its full life cycle. Speaking of, you actually have this handy dandy property down here called stop action. If you were to instantiate this particle system into our scene and just let it run its course, it will never actually by default get destroyed in our hierarchy unless you change this stop action over here in your inspector from none to destroy. After the duration of the entire particle system, it will just get destroyed as a game object in the hierarchy. Now, I do wonder if we could kind of fade each individual particle with some color over lifetime. With it having the emission property, I'm not sure actually how big of an effect this is going to have. let's just change it color over lifetime. I'm not going to actually change the color itself, but I am going to change the opacity of each particle over the life cycle of each particle. So on the left here, we're going to have an alpha transparency of 255, or basically 100%. And on this side, I'm just going to drag that all the way down, hoping it kind of fades a little bit. It's probably a pretty mild effect with the emitting properties, but I think you can see a small difference, question mark. Yeah, good enough for now. Let's go ahead and prefab this destroyed ship VFX. We'll just go ahead and drag this into our prefabs folder as such. Now is the time to get this instantiating through our custom C# code. So I'll go ahead and delete this default prefab from my scene. And let's open back up our enemy class attached to each one of these test enemies. Instead of immediately destroying this game object when our enemy is destroyed, let's go ahead and instantiate our destroyed VFX. I use instantiation all the time, and everyone that's ever opened up Unity before also does too. There's a few different ways to use instantiate. You can declare the instantiation method a few different ways. This is what's referred to as method overloading. If you just want to instantiate the original object that you can pass through, say something like a serialized field, for example, you can do that. However, it'll just spawn in world space at the same coordinates that you created your prefab. So the most common declaration that I typically see when instantiating objects is this fourth declaration. You'll instantiate the object itself, the position you want to instantiate, as well as the rotation that you can define as whatever you'd like. And there's a couple different optional overloads that you can use that will sometimes come in handy. For example, you can use these three same parameters to get the object, position, and rotation, but if you tack on a parent game object as well, it will immediately parent this new game object in our hierarchy to the parent of our choice. With our newfound knowledge, let's go ahead and implement this into our enemy class. Let's go ahead and type instantiate and three different parameters. Well, we know we need our destroyed VFX. We haven't created that as a serialized field. Let's go ahead and do that. So we want a serialized field of just a private game object. We'll just call it destroyed VFX. So we'll just want to remember to assign our prefab to this destroyed VFX in our inspector field when we get back to Unity. Coming back down to instantiate, we want a position. Well, where do we want to spawn this? In other words, instantiate it at our enemy position of our enemy ship where it's destroyed. So transform.position. And then we just need to pass through a rotation. Well, there's a few different ways to do rotation. You could do something like destroyed.transform.rotation if you'd like to instantiate it with the same rotation as the destroyed VFX. In our case, it doesn't actually have a rotation. I think it's just 0, 0, 0. Our particle system is just a sphere. It doesn't really matter. So a nice little handy shortcut that you'll often see is quaternion.identity to spawn in with a rotation of 0, 0, 0, or in other words, just no default rotation. All right, with that set up, let's head back into Unity and see what that looks like. Let's go find our explosion prefab. Here we go. In our prefabs folder, click a test enemy, find our enemy class, and we'll just drag that prefab into our destroyed VFX. And let's make sure we apply that to every individual prefab in our scene. So scrolling up, overrides, and bit of a gotcha. You won't actually be able to apply it to this prefab. Well, that's because we never actually unpacked this prefab, so it's still directly attached to the FBX model directly in our imported assets folder. I can just show you that real quick. We've got GDTV assets, sci-fi ship, models. Each one of these models is just an FBX file. Let's see if I can actually see that anywhere. You could actually even open this in the File Explorer, for example, and just see that each individual file is just an FBX file. In other words, it's the model directly, so it's not going to let us prefab that. I think it's time to have a deep conversation about the different way to prefab things in Unity. Let's tackle that in the next couple lectures. For now, let's just go ahead and highlight all four of our test enemies that we're about to delete anyways, and we'll lock that in the inspector. And let's make sure we assign this destroyed VFX. So assets, prefabs, destroyed VFX. There we go. Go ahead and hit play, test that out. And we've got some nice explosions, question mark. We have a fireworks show. Wow, that's a fun little bug. Let's go tackle that one together. You know what? I actually just realized I know what it is. I think it's because we're still looping the particle system is my guess. Let's make sure we unlock this in the inspector. Click into our destroyed particle effect, and there you go. Good guess. I think this will solve our little problem. Maybe you catched that earlier and you were yelling at me, Steven, it's looping. Well, it was a fun little fireworks show while we had it, but for now, there we go. We've just got one singular explosion happening on each individual spaceship. So you could modify it now, but I've got some tricks up my sleeve when we talk about prefab variants. When you're ready to move on, I'll see you on the next lecture.